It's a historic day when we have, as we have Representative Porter join us. We were a little late because we were having a riveting talk behind the scenes, which you'll now join us in. But just like that, we have our ticket. Joe Biden named Senator Kamala Harris yesterday as his running mate, and it's a massive historic stride toward a more equal democracy. I mean, Senator Harris, like most elected officials, has a complicated record, but there is absolutely no doubt she's breaking barriers, becoming the first woman Attorney General of California, the second Black woman elected to the US Senate, now the first African-American woman and first South Asian Democratic VP nominee. So it's an exciting moment. As we celebrate the significance of this moment, we do at the nation, we continue to focus on our mission. We know this election is bigger than the candidates, though we need to defeat Donald Trump. We know that the power of the party lies in that fusion of electoral and movement politics, expanding our base, telling the story of our communities, and being bold in our determination, as we have been at the nation for so many years, in bringing structural change to the country. Today, it's a great honor to have Representative Katie Porter with us. We've had some of her colleagues, Pramila Jayapal, Ro Khanna, Jamie Raskin. Congresswoman Porter is the first Democrat to win a House seat in California's 45th Congressional District since a seat was created in 1983. And by the way, to have a congressperson from California, you will find is most interesting on this day because of Katie Porter's connections, both her own work, but her connections to Kamala. Her mentor and admirer, if I might say so, has been Senator Elizabeth Warren. And she was a student of Warren's at Harvard Law, also just learned of Elena Kagan and Martha Minow. Warren remembers Porter as, quote, fully prepared, ready to go, leaning forward, all systems go. And Katie's a force in her very own right. In Washington, as a member of the House Financial Services Committee and the House Oversight and Reform Committee, you've probably seen her asking tough questions, expert questions of the CEOs and administration officials to hold them accountable to the American people. At a hearing, I think it was last year, Porter pushed JP Morgan's Chase's Jamie Dimon to explain why his employees' wages were so low. Dimon did not have an answer. In mid-March, Porter whipped out her signature whiteboard and illustrated what it would cost an uninsured American to undergo coronavirus diagnostics. The figure was $1,331. Fear of these costs is going to keep people from being tested, she said, from getting care they need, from keeping their communities safe. She told the hearing room, which included the CDC's chair, Dr. Robert Redfield. He folded and admitted, yes. And Porter was said, I'm not letting them off the hook because I believe in democracy, I believe in government. She's also been a key and tenacious supporter of legislation to New Start money. As the first single mother in Congress raising 3 young children, 8 to 14 years old, Porter knows firsthand the challenges faced by working families. I recommend our profile of Porter of February 2020 and how she wants to make it easier for single moms like her to serve in Congress. Women, even on this day, still make up, I believe it's just 24% of Congress. And Porter knows that without a structural change, that's not going to change. So she can tell us about some of the legislation she's introduced to make it more possible for people like Katie, for women, for single women. And I just want to say, she'll tell us a little, I hope. I saw her on MSNBC last night on Lawrence O'Donnell. She's worked closely with Senator Harris when I believe Harris was Attorney General on the foreclosure housing crisis. And she played an important role in that. And she's also been a PAC leader for 70 Cub Scouts, which demands a keen knack for scheduling. I'm very excited to have Representative Porter with us today to talk about her work. And I do hope at some point she will address whether Governor Gavin Newsom of California might be appointing her to fill Kamala Harris's Senate seat, which is a discussion many are having. Thank you for joining us. Very grateful.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you to Sarah, Erin, Katrina, and everybody behind the scenes at The Nation and on my staff for making this conversation happen. I just want to take one moment to say thank you so much for having this be closed caption. It's incredibly important to make things accessible and make policy accessible to all Americans. So thank you for facilitating that and doing that. Please bear with me a little bit as my morning coffee gets going. I had a late night last night, and this is relatively early for me here, and especially during the time of coronavirus, it is very hard to be living this bi-coastal lifestyle. I think it's one aspect of running and serving in Congress that I just didn't give enough thought to. Every morning when I wake up, there are typically 40 or 50 emails from staff, some of them saying, "Did you get my message that I sent an hour ago?" And no, I did not get the message you sent at 4 o'clock. And I didn't get the one you sent at 5 o'clock my time either. But I do the flip side to them, which is I'm often emailing them at 10 and 11 night, which is 1 and 2 in the morning for them. So thank you everyone from across the country for joining us today. I want to talk a little bit, I want to talk about Kamala and how excited I am. I want to talk about campaigns and all of those things. But I wanted to start by talking a little bit about something that I don't think we talk enough about, which is what the work of being a Congress member actually is. Because in the electoral scrum of who's going to win and how do we win, I think sometimes we don't talk about the job. What really does it take to do it? And what do we mean when we say to really represent people and to be a good member of Congress? You can read about my background on Wikipedia, and Katrina did a wonderful job summarizing it. But I want to peel back the curtain a little bit and talk about how I think about what does it mean to be a Congress member. And how I think about that is informed by what I did before and what I want to accomplish in Congress. So let me start with a basic set of facts and and this is the reality that I think we need to confront that we just don't talk about. First, the American people don't have a lot of confidence in us. Regardless of which party is in the majority in the White House, Congress has consistently low approval ratings, like right at the same level of cockroaches. It's not good. And we don't really benefit from hiding from that fact and pretending that who's unpopular is the Republicans or who's unpopular is the Democrats. We have a problem that is cross-party, that is even outside of the party system, where the American people don't think we're doing a good job and they don't approve of us. And we need to tackle that head on. The second thing is that Congress is based on a lot of traditions. Some of those are good and important, and some, frankly, are bad and outdated. But the thing about traditions is that they can be questioned, they can be changed. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about in conjunction with the members of the new class of 2018 and the soon-to-be new class of 2020, who I think will be our partners in really understanding that not all traditions serve us well. The third one, and I'm going to talk more about each of these, but the third one that's easy to forget, I think, for some people who live and breathe DC, is that a lot of Americans just aren't that interested in politics, and they just aren't that interested in what we do in Washington. They're busy with work, with family, with worship, with a number of other things. For them, politics is an opportunity to get up and get a glass of water, to go make some microwave popcorn. It's a break. When they see political commercials, they turn away actively from them. And so we work for them, for those people who aren't interested, who don't engage just as much. We have an obligation to work for them just as much as for those who are on Twitter every day, tagging and interacting with us. If you choose to deny or ignore these facts or pretend they don't matter, I think you're going to be limited in how effective you can be as a Congress member. So I try to confront these realities, all of which I think are important to try to change head on. So accepting that Congress doesn't have a great approval rating, I try to keep it very real with my constituents. A funny thing that's happened to me a number of times is I have reporters who are profiling me, which is always really great to have the opportunity to talk about what I'm working on, but they'll say, tell me something like, what's the real you? And I'm like, dude, this is it. Like, this is as real as it gets. Like, before I got on, I had to go make sure I wasn't revealing anything too weird in the background. Those are 2 American Girl cookbooks, but I just like had to go check to see like what's going to be in the background of my Zoom. I'm sitting here from my kitchen, so I'm just who I am, and I try. There's no hidden Katie. And I will tell you that makes the job of being my comms director probably a little bit more challenging because there's just me. The same person who's asking tough questions in hearings or reading CRS reports is the same person who's raising 3 kids and going to the grocery store and sometimes trying to do all of those things at the same time. So sometimes I'll get people who say to me like, oh my God, it's you, you're in the grocery store. And I always want to say to them, is there some other way to get this food on my budget? Because I would love to not be pushing one cart and pulling another to get enough food to feed 3 hungry kids. And so I think being a straight shooter is really, really helpful when you represent an ideologically diverse district. And my district's diverse, not just in terms of ethnic and religious diversity, but that partisanship. This is still a majority Republican district. And I'll go into town halls and get people who ask questions that are questions like, Democrats don't believe in border security. Which, we have to then have a conversation about that. Or why do you hate Donald Trump, right? And so I get these kinds of challenging questions in my town halls, and being a straight shooter back, I think is really, really helpful in being able to address that. Debate is a healthy part of our democracy. We shouldn't be afraid of debating ideas. We shouldn't be afraid of having disagreement. What I think we should fear is when that process of debate and that process of democracy breaks down. And that's what's happening, for example, in the Senate. They're not voting and we're not getting our way. They're not voting. They're not taking bills up. That, I think, is the core and the sort of the crux of the perception that people have about Congress that then leads us to think that we're not doing our job. The second thing I mentioned is that Congress is steeped in tradition, and you feel it most powerfully. I feel it most powerfully when I walk up the steps. I go outside to go between my office and the Capitol, and yes, I like the fresh air, but I also cannot figure out those tunnels, and I don't understand why you want to be lost next to a deep freeze in the Rayburn building when you can just go outside and walk upstairs. But you feel it. I mean, the steps of the Capitol literally are worn down, the marble steps, the footsteps of those who have come before you. So you think a lot about the tradition when you're doing that. But I also think every member of an institution has an obligation to try to improve it, to make sure that it's adapting, to try to make it do better. And so we should be willing to interrogate those traditions. We should be willing to ask, why do we do it this way? Does it serve the purpose that it's supposed to be saying? And some traditions make a lot of sense. I mean, one tradition that I think I've been pleasantly surprised by is the caucus system. At first, I thought this was like extracurricular clubs kind of in college. And there's a good reason I thought that. I mean, if you look at the list of caucuses, one of the things you'll learn is that Congress has not 1, but 2 caucuses devoted to concrete. They have like cement. So they have the concrete caucus, and hold it, the ready mix concrete caucus. So it was, I think I understandably didn't know whether this was going to be a very valuable system. But it has been. I benefited tremendously from being a member of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. The work that we've done to call out hate crimes against the API community, both before but particularly during COVID. The conversation that Representative Judy Chu recently facilitated with Dr. Fauci, and talking about and getting him to promise to make sure that NIH, as they do clinical trials, is keeping track of the API community and not just categorizing them as other. Those are really terrific and helpful things. And I founded a caucus myself, the College Affordability Caucus, to talk about the sticker price of college. We have a huge problem with student loans, and we talk about it a lot. There's also a sticker price aspect, that college just isn't affordable without loans. And that's a problem that wasn't true 2 generations ago or a generation ago, and we need to get back to that. So let me be honest, though, you didn't get up and get on Zoom to hear me talk about what I like about Congress or about concrete. You wanted to hear some hot takes about what I'm not a fan of. So let me tell you about some of the traditions of Congress that I'm at work changing. One is it's rather small. Well, it's actually large, you'll see is the problem, but I think it's interesting in that it reflects a lot about the place. Did you know that all the furniture in Congress is made in Congress? They don't order it. They actually have carpenters who build the furniture, which I think is great to see this being made right there in the Capitol for purposes in the Capitol. But when I met with the architect of the Capitol, his face when I asked if I could get a standing desk, I mean, a little bit of him died. I then tried to explain that I didn't want my desk placed between me and my constituents or my office visitors. That the desk is not there to barricade or I want to be in conversation with people, and so the desk would need to be going back in a corner. And the most interesting part of it is we couldn't find a chair where my feet could actually touch the ground. And that was high end, like the right size for the desk. So we spent time trying to get lower desks and higher chairs. But the assumption is that you don't really sit there, that you don't really do work, which is not true. And that you're like Abe Lincoln's size. And so I'm not even a particularly short woman, but the furniture really is sized for like 6 foot and up. And it's designed to impose. It's designed to put a barrier between you and those who come into your office and to reinforce to them that you are in power and they are not. And that is not the kind of office and the kind of setup that I wanted. And it was interesting to talk with a lot of my fellow freshmen about their own conversations with the architect of the Capitol pushing back on this. Another tradition, and it's so great, my staff has said that what I should say here is that I think could use some improvement. But what I would like to tell you is another tradition that sucks is the congressional calendar. When we're not in the midst of the pandemic, Congress is typically in session 4 days a week. And for someone like me who flies from the West Coast or someone who flies from and I fly out of my local airport, usually out of Orange County Airport, that means 19 hours a week, door to door in transit. And that is 19 hours a week that I cannot be engaged in conversations like this, that I cannot be talking with my staff. I make great use of that time. I write a lot of handwritten thank you notes. I write back to every student who writes to me by hand. And I remember when I started doing that, I said to my son, I think quite sanctimoniously, I'm writing back to children who write to me, Luke. Isn't that nice of me? And he said, God, Mom, you're wasting your time. And I said, no, children they write to me and they want to hear back from me. And he said, no, Mom, you're writing in cursive. Nobody can read that. You're wasting your time. So I now very dutifully print back to students who write to me so I can make sure that they can actually read what they send. But I make good use of that time in transit. But to be clear, that time, we're spending more days in transit than we are in DC. And I think relatedly, this entire concept, the entire word of the idea of recess, that we're on recess when we're back in our districts, just needs to be purged from the vocabulary. I am busier here in some ways than I am in DC. It's an 18-hour day either way. And the work that I do when I am in my district, listening to people, touring businesses, going into schools, it is every bit as important and as worthwhile and as valuable as what happens in DC. So I think we need to change that language and change that calendar to reduce the travel time, to give us more time to do the substantive work. The last thing I want to talk about is this idea that for a lot of Americans, politics is not their priority. So I wake up and say to myself, I'm a mom, I'm a Californian, I'm a Democrat. Most Americans, that is not on their list, right? That political identity is just not core to who they are. They're busy. They're trying to make ends meet. They're trying to work. They're worrying about their bank accounts. They're worrying about whether or not they have enough milk. They're worrying about how their kids or parents are faring during this pandemic. They're too tired to watch the local news because getting by is hard. And so part of my job, I think, as a Congress member is to think about how can we make it easier for people to engage? And how can we break down some of those resistances that are both structural and sometimes personal to engaging in politics? And this was a big challenge in Orange County. I mean, I sometimes joke that, in Orange County, it's easier to ask somebody if they get their hair dyed or if that car is a lease than if they're a Democrat or a Republican. It's just been a place where the emphasis on civility has meant that people aren't comfortable talking about their opinions about our country, and we need to break that down. So one of the things I always try to do, both in my hearings, but also in the written work product that we do, is try to approach things from the standpoint of, if you didn't know anything about this, where would you start? And it's the same assumption I had when I walked into the classroom. I always wanted my students to do the homework, but I always knew that some hadn't. And I wanted them to be able to follow along and engage in the conversation. So we try to produce the things that we write at the 8th grade reading level. That is a reading level that's reflective of the diverse education levels that we have in this country, including people for whom English is not a preferred language, and the fact that people who are reading this are reading it while they're in the middle of dinner or if they have a spare moment. And so we try to make sure that we're using everyday language, that we're starting at the beginning, that we avoid using acronyms and other things that put distance between the issue that I'm working on and people's connection to that issue. And so you might have seen in the recent profile that was done of me and Elle, I went off to the reporter about how I feel about the word impact. And I basically banned my staffers from saying that unless a meteor hits the earth. So if a meteor comes and it lands on the earth, it will make an impact. But federal workers during the shutdown at the start of 2018 weren't impacted. They were hurt. They were harmed. People who've gotten sick from COVID aren't impacted by COVID. They're sickened. They're made ill. Their lives are at risk. And we need to use language that reveals what's at stake. And a word like impact suggests that you're not willing to own the real consequences of the problem. And so we don't use the word impact to obscure the important work or the important issues that we're taking on. We don't say things like, and Katrina mentioned this at the start, we don't say things like, if people can't get tested, that'll have a bad impact or that'll have an impact. We say if people can't get tested for COVID, Americans will die. If insurers deny claims for COVID testing and treatment, people won't be impacted. People won't get treatment and they will go broke. They will go bankrupt from those medical bills. And so it's really important to be, I think, as clear as you can be about what the consequences are. Last but not least, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge my staff. This is another tradition of Congress that just mystifies me. Why on earth don't we all talk all of the time about the staff that help us do what we do? Nobody should want their Congress member to be operating alone. I've met these people. I consider myself a fairly well-educated, fairly diligent, hardworking member of Congress. I don't know everything. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of the staffers, from those who helped me make my very first 1-minute speech, which by the way wasn't 1 minute and I got gavelled down, to the people who help educate me about things in foreign relations or Pentagon. You can't do it alone. You can't get elected alone, but boy, you cannot do this job alone. And so I find it so interesting that we as Congress members so often hide our staffers rather than bringing them into the conversations with us. And so I think that is something that I just want to mention that I think is incredibly important. And I'm really proud of the work that my staff does every single day. So, as my judge used to say, I clerk for a federal judge, and he used to say, if you like my opinion, my clerks wrote it. If you don't like it, it's my fault. And I think that's a good way that we ought to be thinking about what we do in Congress. So with that, I'll close and take as many questions as we have time for. Thank you so much, everyone, for engaging, and I can't wait to have more conversation with you.
Thank you so much for your honesty, for your clarity, for being so reflective. That's a big word. For being so reflective and for acknowledging, I think, something we talk about at the Nation, and I'm going to ask you one question and move it on to all our people. So often, I think there's a bad habit of blaming people for not, voting the right way. And I think what you said is so important. People have lives. They're working 2 jobs. They got kids. Our work is politics, broadly defined. I would define it, I think you might, as improving people's lives, the condition of people's lives. And so we get lost sometimes, and I think it's sort of dead on arrival to blame people. I did want to ask you, because I was tweeting, and people are saying she's awesome, she's fearless, and in our chat, the best. Would you become a senator if Governor Newsom approaches you? Are you interested? It's quick, it's just of yesterday, but I have to ask, people are asking.
Well, first, I just want to take a moment to say how exciting yesterday was, how really, really fun it was, and what a bright spot it was in such a dark time to get to celebrate. And I remember how painful it was in 2016 on the day that I took my then 4-year-old daughter and told her today we were going to elect a woman president. And so to get to tell my kids that our senator, our California Senator Kamala Harris, someone that they know that I've worked with, they know who has helped and mentored me, is our vice presidential nominee and will be, I firmly believe, our vice president, and that it will be a historic vice presidency, both because of who Kamala is in terms of race and being a woman, but also because of who she is in terms of how she fights for justice and the way that she thinks about those issues. And we all have a role to play in this presidency, including in this vice presidency, in pushing Vice President Biden and Senator Harris, in advocating for them to do more and to do better. And we don't, those things are not in tension. You celebrate as you push forward. So again, to go back to my work in the classroom, I would say to the student who got the correct answer, great answer. And then I would think to myself, I'm going to talk to that student after class about what they're planning to do with their career and make sure that they're going to take that next advanced class, or they're aiming high enough in what they're going to achieve. So kudos to Senator Harris, really a lovely day, and to all of the amazing women who were being considered for that position. In terms of the Senate and what's going to happen, I mean, first we have to win the presidency, and that's first and foremost. And so I was excited to get to do an event for the vice president, now for Senator Harris, for the ticket yesterday with Elizabeth Warren. And it was wonderful to be in conversation with her and be reminded of one of the many great women who were being considered. But I think there's some interesting things that this whole process raises. And one of them is that this will initially be an appointment by the governor as opposed to an election. And I think one of the things we ought to be very cognizant of is that presents a different dynamic. And there are ways in which that forecloses opportunity to some, but then maybe creates more opportunity for weighing other factors. So as we think about electorates, what do electorates do or think? How do electorates behave with regard to how the perceptions that they bring to minority candidates or to women, for example? There are ways that appointments can help us overcome those kinds of barriers. But there are also ways in which appointments are deeply anti-democratic. And, you know, I'm a newcomer to politics. And so 4 years ago, when I went to run, not only was this race and this area not on the map as a Democratic target, I wasn't on the map. I was a law professor who had the wonderful good fortune to do work side by side with Elizabeth Warren and with Kamala Harris and to learn from them. But without those two women lifting me up at the start of my campaign never would have lifted off the ground. And so that's something that I think about. But to be clear, I get up every day wanting to make the world a better place and believing deeply, even in this troubled time, even when it's heartbreaking, believing in the potential of the people of this country and its core institutions. So I can't imagine ruling out any position where I could honestly look at it and say, I could make people's lives better. I could create a more fair economy. I could work on income inequality. I could work on a more progressive foreign policy. I could work on consumer protection. If I thought a job had that, I would step up and do it. And it's exactly, by the way, why when Kamala Harris asked me to serve as the monitor for the bank settlement, I said yes. I had a tiny baby. When Kamala called me, my daughter was on the floor of my office. I'd done that, I'll take her to work just for a minute. And then 2 hours later, she was fussing on the floor. And Kamala called me. I never spoken to her in my life. I was connected through Senator Warren to her and to that job. But I took the job because it gave me an opportunity to help people stay in their homes. And so I can't imagine ruling out any job as a matter of right. But I can also tell you that the problems here in Orange County, the need to try to create better, stronger representation at the local government here in Orange County, for example, the county government is acute. And I'm very, very focused on that going into November.
Thank you. I want to turn it over to Erin, if I could. And thank you again just for being such a great straight shooter and honest. Over to Erin.
Yeah, thank you. So we have people on our call today from just about half of the country. So thank you. You're talking to a pretty broad group of people and a pretty energized group of people. So let me get to some of these questions. Mary Gatter is wondering about the repair that's going to be necessary. And this is a hopeful question. We're going to continue the hopeful thread. If we take back the White House and if we take both houses of Congress, you know, what are your top 3 priorities?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's one that I think a lot about. I was on a Zoom recently with some other California freshmen, and we were asked, what adjective, what one word do we think about when we think about November, when we think about the election? And most of my colleagues said something like ready, can't wait, hopeful, all of these things. And I said tough. And the reason I said that is even assuming we win, and I believe we will win, and I believe we will win the Senate, by the way. And I think we will expand our House majority, not just in numbers, but in the quality of the people in the House, which I'm really excited about. But repairing the trust of the American people in government is hard. And I think a lot about this from what I saw in the foreclosure crisis. When people were losing their homes, when their market fell apart, when there was unemployment, when the global economy blew up, the people who called me when I was working for the Attorney General as the California Monitor didn't blame Democrats. They didn't blame Republicans. They blamed government. Period. Government. And that's a moment where I think we are at risk of being with COVID. So do I think the president has horribly mismanaged the pandemic and cost Americans lives, literally killed people? Yes, I do. And I think Democrats in the House are working really hard to try to get help, to try to do right, to try to provide critical programs, food assistance, housing, all of these things. But at the end of the day, when people are scared, when the economy is at risk, when people are unemployed, when they're worried about opportunity for their kids, when they're worried about how they're going to be able to make ends meet, that fear translates into anger at government. When people needed help, their government wasn't there for them. And that's the legacy that Donald Trump and his administration is leaving us with. And so I think first and foremost, we have to think about how do we repair that? And so I think a lot of it is going to be actually in building an administration that is focused on putting quality people into jobs, and not just the cabinet jobs. It's really fun to get on and think about who's going to be secretary of this or who's going to be secretary of that. But let me tell you who runs this country. It's the deputy undersecretary, 5 people deep in the Department of Justice. So just to give you one example, I took bankruptcy with Elizabeth Warren. The person who runs the bankruptcy system, they're not on your radar. You don't know who they are. But boy, do they change the system in ways that can either be helpful or hurtful for people who've gotten cancer and lost their jobs and couldn't work and need help in dealing with debt. So I think one of our top priorities has to be rebuilding our agencies and the trust in our agencies, including things like protecting and strengthening the Inspector General system, but making appointments all the way up and down, not just the top few, all the way up and down. And I think, by the way, that is a fair critique of something that President Obama wasn't as strong at as he might have been. He put in people at the top, but left a lot of these people. And it was part of his, let me try to build a bipartisan coalition. But if you're still in the Trump administration today and you're a political appointee or you have any amount of power and you haven't spoken up or spoken out, I really question whether you're the kind of leader that's going to be able to solve the problems that we face today. So I think focusing on rebuilding that administrative state is really important. The other thing I think is that we do need to be willing to tackle special interest in politics. And we've seen so much change, for example, with the NRA from even 4 or 6 years ago. It's hard to remember that 6 or 8 years ago, a lot of Democrats took NRA money. Not 1 or 2 who are now on their way out, but a lot. But there are still powerful special influences. In the debate that we had over prescription drug pricing, the number of people who were nervous about voting for a bill that literally just let Medicare negotiate drug prices. What could be more capitalistic than letting us negotiate for the price of something? And yet there were people who were worried about it. And so I think the movement to not take corporate PAC money in Congress, the fact that there are now 60 plus people who don't take corporate PAC money, and again, 4 years ago, there were 2 or 4 people. That is a huge trend, and it is reshaping who gets heard in Congress, what bills move, how legislation gets written, but there is a lot more work to do to get those people in. But the last thing I think about in terms of repairing and rebuilding, it's again more of a structural point and not a specific piece of policy. Because when you look at Donald Trump's policy, it's like all bad. So how can I pick amongst his horrible education policy, his environmental policy, his economic policy, his foreign policy? It's like all bad. So I'm thinking more about the structures. And one of them that I would point to is the need for, both in the administration, in the White House, but in our democratic institutions, thinking about how we nurture and lift up multi-generational leadership. And notice I use the term multi-generational, not just young, because I have a lot of respect for some of the senior people who have been there, who have taught me, who have listened to me, who have helped me, who have said, Katie, I hear you, that's frustrating. Here's how we might change it, but it's not gonna happen between now and 4 o'clock. So you just need to take a deep breath and have a Diet Dr. Pepper. But multi-generational leadership, and that's not what Congress has in the Democratic side. We have a strict seniority system, and I think there's a need to rethink that. And I think we made some important movement with 2018. Speaker Pelosi did give subcommittee gavels and vice chair gavels to freshmen. But there's a need to continue to think about how do we create multi-generational leadership. And in a strict seniority system, one of the things that happens is not only are the committee chairs people who've been in office 30 years, but to be in office 30 years, you almost definitionally have to come from an extremely safe Democratic area, and you have to have gotten elected very young, which often means that you came from the kind of privileged background that let you get elected very young. That is, your parent was in Congress, and it's always a dad. Your husband or your father was in Congress. Or you knew you wanted to be in politics right from the beginning, and your family facilitated that. So I think that's something structurally, that multi-generational leadership, I want to see it out of the White House, I want to see it in administrative agencies, and I want to see it in the House and Senate.
So right now we're watching a campaign to create mistrust over mail-in ballots, and it's in rhetoric, but there are also operational and financial acts being taken against the post office to make it, well, difficult. So Michael's asking what Congress can do to support the USPS, and Richard would like specifically what will and is being done to prevent the desperate anti-democratic attempts to cripple the USPS and limit mail-in ballots.
Yeah, great question. And as a Californian, I have a lot of experience with mail-in ballots, and actually Orange County in March in the primary, not because of COVID, but because of the continued commitment to try to expand access to voting. Every voter in Orange County in my primary in March received a mail-in ballot. And primaries in California are open primaries. So I was on the ballot alongside 5 Republicans and managed to get exactly 50% of the vote, which wasn't exactly the most, my happiest day. It means I have a tough race coming up. But I think we have some experience with mail-in ballots here in California that we can hopefully use to understand what to do. With regard to the post office, let's just be clear. He's making his cinnamon toast crunch. That's my 14-year-old. He's trying very hard not to be part of the conversation. with regard to the post office, we need to think about the post office and talk about the post office for what it is, which is a civic treasure. It is part of our government. It is part of our institution. We need to treasure it. And so we need to fund it, and we need to protect it from structural harms that allow it, that have put it where it is today. So many people don't know, the last several years ago, there was a law passed that requires the post office to fully pre-fund its pension, 100% fully pre-fund its pension. That's not something that any business in this country could possibly do. That's not something that we ask any other part of government to do. So we're putting those kind of barriers on the post office, and then they say, well, look, you're failing. We're hampering them from modernizing, from offering more services to the community, postal banking, being able to sell products that people need. And then we're pointing at them and saying, you're failing. So I'm a huge champion for the post office. I think it's an incredibly important institution. I think about all of the seniors right now who are relying on the post office to get medicine, and other people who are not able to leave their homes to get medicine. I think about the role the post office has long played in serving the community of people with disabilities. It is such an important institution. So we have to fund it. We have to fight Trump's attacks on it. The Oversight Committee is gearing up to have a hearing looking at what Trump is doing and Trump's appointee as Postmaster General is doing to the post office. But to be clear, first and foremost, if you, like me, want to save the post office, then get out there and vote for Biden-Harris and make sure everybody you know can and does. We have to try to help the post office hang on for the next 84 days. And when we win the White House and the Senate and the House, then we can begin the structural reform to rebuild the post office and to allow it to recreate itself for the next several generations of Americans. With regard to mail-in balloting, I mean, this whole dynamic over absentee versus mail-in and the language confusion, one of the things that I'm a big fan of is making sure that we're pushing for secretaries of state and county registrar of voters to be adapting and using technology to combat some of these risks and perceptions. And so in Orange County, for example, you can track your ballot. You can see that it was mailed to you. You can see that it was received. You can see that it was opened. You can see that it was either counted or not counted. If it was not counted, you can see the reason, and you have the opportunity to contact the registrar and try to fix that. That is the kind of transparency that we ought to be bringing to this entire voting process. And so I think the American public, by the way, strongly supports vote by mail. Trump is trying to sow disinformation, but I think we just need to keep pushing back at it. And I think we also, as progressives, I just want to caution, need to be realistic about what we can accomplish with vote by mail, particularly in this cycle. Vote by mail, every American, especially in this pandemic, but I think in general, every American should have the right to vote by mail, should be able to vote whether they can't get out of work or they can't leave their house, whether they're home with kids, something like 30% of polling places today are not handicap accessible, holding back people with disabilities from being able to exercise their right to vote. So I'm a firm believer that everybody should get a mail ballot. But historically, in the last couple of years, when you look at who chooses to vote by mail, that coalition is older, whiter, and more conservative. And I can tell you, sitting here in Orange County, that's not my winning coalition to keep this seat. So we have to recognize that there's a significant proportion of Americans who still want to go in person to vote. They don't trust a mail-in ballot. They don't believe it will be counted. And giving them electronic verification and a system to track their ballot can help address some of those concerns over time.
Thank you. Adam C. is asking, what do you think is the most important regulation that needs to be placed on financial institutions to get them to be more responsive to the needs of ordinary Americans and small businesses?
Great question. I know it's so hard. It's always so hard when it's the one. I guess one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the concentration of power in financial institutions. And I've been thinking a lot about the concentration of power in our economy generally. I'm currently reading both Monopolized and Break 'em Up. And so I'm thinking a lot about what it means to say I'm an anti-monopolist. And I recently got in a vigorous fight with my brother about what was a monopoly. And it actually ended in my leaving the Facebook, the message chat with my family in protest, because we did not share agreement about what is monopoly power and why is it dangerous. But I grew up in small town Iowa, on a farm actually, not even in a town. The nearest town had a couple hundred people, and I saw all of that local banking system. And it was very hard during the financial crisis. Those local banks didn't have the political power in Washington that our large banks have to get help for farmers. But there was also so much community and so much knowledge and so much compassion and so much thoughtfulness baked into how they went about dealing with people who were struggling. My dad was a small town loan officer. He always told me the most important decisions I make are when I have to say no to a loan. Sometimes I do more good saying no than yes. Because I keep some people from taking on loans that they cannot pay or they're not ready to take out. And so, here in Orange County, we have a huge credit union community, and California generally has strong credit unions, but we have virtually no community banks. And that's true in a lot of places. You can literally stand in a shopping center in Irvine and stand in one spot and see a Bank of America, a Wells Fargo, and a Chase. And I took a picture of this when I was working for Senator then AG Harris, supervising those three banks. And I texted it to her and I said, I'm on the job. I have eyes on all three of these large institutions. But I think we need to make space for smaller institutions, for innovation. The banks have made it. So here's a concrete change I would make. Remember as checking ceased to be free and the fees for checking went up? One of the ways you could get free checking was if you set up direct payments. So if you agreed to have your electric bill auto debited or your car payment made, automatically monthly bill paid, then if you have so many of these, say 7 or 10, the bank will give you, in its beneficence, free checking. There's nothing kind or generous about that. That's creating stickiness. It is horrifically hard to unwind all of those auto debits, and you often in the process of doing it will end up being late somewhere or get dinged or miss a payment. And so they're making it very hard for bank customers to actually vote with their feet and say, I don't want to be I don't want to continue to be a customer of Wells Fargo. I'm concerned about their executive leadership. I don't want to be a customer of Bank X, Mega Bank B. I want to be focused on a bank that is doing more in my community. So I think unwinding some of that, and postal banking, I see in the chat, that's part of that. Thinking about how we regulate fintech to avoid some of the mistakes we've made with traditional banking regulation. Those are all issues that I think a lot about. But I would like to see consumers feel that they have more choice in banking and then actually be able to have those choices because they're not sort of hemmed in to sticking with their bank through structural choices the bank has made about banking.
I'd like to build on your opening remarks when you talked about the expense of college, and that's all goes to debt, and some of this debt starts really early. So Kristen Cabral asks, tell us about the effect of student debt on Americans and on our country.
Yeah, we have a huge crisis of student loan debt, and I want to be really clear about this point. The crisis of student loan debt is not just a crisis of those who have student loan debt. It is an overall crisis for our economy. So if you never had debt, good for you. If you went to college back when it cost $50 or whatever, these numbers that just seem impossible to me, good for you. If your parents or grandparents were able to pay or you got a scholarship, great. But the student loan debt overhang is holding back our entire economy. It is both a microeconomic household financial problem, but also a structural macroeconomic problem. And there are some wonderful studies by progressive economists showing that if we would lift that student loan debt burden and substantially relieve that student loan debt burden, our entire economy would be stronger, would be more stable, and would have more engine, more potential for innovation. Student loan debt is also not a young person's problem. And I think, I watched with sort of the Bernie campaign, and some people I know, including the Cinnamon Toast Crunch eater, is a Bernie voter. Well, he wasn't a voter, but he was a Bernie fan. At one point in my house, I had Bernie fan, a Kamala fan, a Booker fan, and I was the Warren co-chair. So it was a real hot mess at the dinner table, let me tell you. I was living the dream every night at dinner. But I think one of the things that is important in sort of young people being attracted to Bernie, because of his willingness to take on student loan debt and actually do something about it, not just pander, was actually student loan debt is a huge problem for middle-aged and older people. I heard Elizabeth Warren say last night, people are having to pay for 20 years. And I thought to myself, Elizabeth, 20, 30, 40. And the fastest growing group of bankruptcy filers in this country is people 70 years and older. And so I think there's an overarching problem of people carrying debt later into life that I'm really interested in, that's connected to that student loan problem. But people who are now trying to retire with 10 or 15 years left on a mortgage. We didn't actuarially build retirement systems that way. And so that's something that I think about all the time. So yes, I think we should forgive student loans, but I think we cannot do that without at the same time having a plan for how we're going to tackle reducing the cost of college going forward. It just doesn't make sense to solve the past and set us up for the same problem again in the future. And so I think one of the things I'm really interested in is we've seen a number of plans for how to reduce and forgive student loan debt. The federal government could do that. It's politically really challenging, but it's policy-wise pretty straightforward. How to bring down the costs of college is actually a more challenging problem. Yes, part of the answer is more federal and state funding, but part of it is also that college costs a lot more. And so states are paying the same proportion of college costs that they used to. It's just that the other half is so many more dollars. And that's something that we really need to have a conversation about, and about the role of the federal government in doing that. So, my goal is to have college that, you could work in the summer and earn enough to pay at least your tuition, if not your room and board. That was true for Senator Elizabeth Warren. It wasn't true for me. It wasn't even close to true for me. When my children found out how much college costs, they told me that they didn't want to go because they don't want to do that to me, Mom. So that is a system that is deeply broken, and that is inhibiting a whole generation of children's ambitions and potential. And so I'm really interested in not just solving the past overhang, which I think is a macroeconomic structural issue for our economy, but also in what these high costs of education are doing to shaping opportunity for young people, particularly in ways that affect people of color, and people from lower income communities, and people from rural areas, people with less advantage.
So I wish we could keep you here for another hour. This is extraordinary, and as it always happens, our time is quickly coming to an end. I want to let you know that there was a lot of support and interest in the chat for thinking about the power words have. And so thank you for bringing that up. I think it's really important. And I just want to ask one more question before I turn it back to Katrina. Cindy Grossman is wondering how a revision of the congressional calendar can help promote awareness of the climate crisis and the need for American workplaces to modify habits.
I love this question. And actually, Scott Peters from San Diego made what he called a climate calendar. And he calculated how much CO2 is emitted, how much dangerous gases are emitted from all of the flying we do. Now, to be clear, on any given airplane, even one departing DCA at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, Congress is still only a minority of the number of overall flyers. But we too have a duty to ask, how can we make a change? How can we contribute? When we can do things remotely and reduce emissions, we should be. And so I really, really want us to be having that conversation. If we would adjust our calendar and, for instance, stay in Congress for 2 weeks straight, stay in DC for 2 weeks straight, including over the weekend, because we work weekends, to be clear. Stay in DC for 2 weeks straight, then come home for 2 weeks and make only one trip there and one trip back a month rather than 3 trips there and 3 trips back. That is a big impact on our climate, but as importantly, it's a big change in how we do our job. It lets different kinds of people from different kinds of places be able to do this job. It opens it up to younger people, to people with families, to people who are going to have to really stretch to live on the congressional salary in high cost of living areas, or who have student loans, for example. And so I think it's a great point, and it's a great example of one of the things I think we ought to be thinking about generally from this pandemic is seeing a shift to minimizing unnecessary work-related travel. It's one of the biggest things that we can do. Car emissions are a huge source of emission, and there's an opportunity here to do it. But I also want to be clear, we can't do it by asking parents, and particularly women, to juggle, to stay home and not have childcare. That isn't just, we have to still have childcare. We have to still figure out how we're going to be able to do that, even as we think about how to allow people to remain home and be productive from home and use technology to do that, to reduce carbon. The last note I wanted to make is I'm really so glad that I've had some consensus and some excitement around this choice of language, because it's one of these, it's such low-hanging fruit, and the work that you do at the Nation and the work that each of you do on social media really has the potential to do that. So I read Don't Think of an Elephant, a terrific and very short book. It took me like an hour and a half to read. My staff has a book club. They've had 4 book club meetings on this like 100-page book. I don't know what they're doing, but they're really interested in it. But it's just things like, I do not say the words tax relief. I talk about investments. I want to make more investment in education. I talk about paying fair taxes and making sure our tax system is fair. And so there's just so many low-hanging opportunities to change our language in ways that not only make the problem more clear, but help get buy-in to the solution as well. So I'm grateful to all of you for joining me as fellow warriors against bad, Trump policy doesn't have an impact.
Thank you so much.
It has a harm.
Thank you
for
for this
talking about it.
Representative Porter, thank you for this extraordinary talk. I think I speak for everyone on this call. I think your humanity, your clarity, your humor, your passion has led us to think anew. About whether it's student debt loan. You spoke so eloquently about fighting and funding for the post office as a civic treasure, civic institution. And thank you for reminding us that politics is really about improving people's lives. And finally, something that doesn't come up enough, I feel so passionately about it, is how do we restore trust in government? FDR once said government is us, but so many have been determined, committed to dismantle government in the people's interest. And I just hope we can stay in touch. Really inspiring, powerful, and the language piece is so important to us at the Nation. I'm going now to look at the next issue to make sure our language, which is often a little up there, can be more clear and accessible, because I do think it's vital in these times and all times. Thank you so much for joining us. And everyone, Chris Hayes, joining us August 26th, and we'll have more. And this will be, Peter, I think your video will be online for people who wish to share it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.